The rain wasn't the heavy, cleansing kind that washes the world clean. It was a miserable gray drizzle that clung to your skin and made the wool of my secondhand coat smell like damp earth and old regrets. I stood on the edge of the paved path in Riverside Park, my sensible shoes sinking slightly into the mud, while my brother Julian and my sister Vanessa stood on the high ground under a canopy of expensive black umbrellas. They didn't look like they were at a funeral. They looked like they were posing for a magazine spread titled The Grief of the Elite. Vanessa's eyes were hidden behind oversized designer sunglasses, her lips pressed into a thin, pale line of bored anticipation. Julian kept checking his gold watch, the metal catching the dull light, his foot tapping a rhythmic, impatient beat against the stone. To them, our grandfather's passing wasn't a tragedy, it was a transaction. And to them, I was just the clerical error in the family ledger, the black sheep who had wasted her life teaching art to children in a drafty community center while they built empires of glass and cold, hard cash. "Can we get this over with, Clara?" Julian called out, his voice cutting through the soft patter of the rain. "Mr. Henderson said the reading had to be here in the park for sentimental reasons, but I have a merger at 4. Some of us actually have stakes in this world." I didn't answer. I just looked at the empty bench near the willow tree, Grandpa Silas's favorite spot. He used to sit there for hours, watching the ducks, talking to the stray dogs, and listening to the stories of the people who passed by. He was the only one who ever really listened to mine. "He loved this park," I whispered, more to myself than to them. "He was eccentric, Clara. Let's call it what it was," Vanessa sighed, adjusting her silk scarf. "He was losing his mind toward the end. Why else would he leave that beautiful estate to be managed by a firm and insist on reading his will in a public space like a common vagrant?" Mr. Henderson, Grandpa's lawyer for 40 years, stepped forward. He was a man who looked like he was made of parchment and old ink, stiff, formal, but with eyes that held a strange flickering kindness when they landed on me. He held a leather briefcase close to his chest. "Silas was very specific," Mr. Henderson said, his voice surprisingly loud in the open air. "He wanted his children, or rather his heirs, to stand where he felt most at home before they received what he had prepared for them." Julian smirked, leaning toward Vanessa. "Watch," he whispered, loud enough for me to hear. "Clara's gonna get the cat. Oh, wait, the cat died 3 years ago. Maybe she'll get his collection of used bus passes." Vanessa let out a sharp, jagged little laugh. "Don't be cruel, Julian. She needs something to remember him by. Maybe a nice framed photo of the bank he didn't leave her a share in." I clutched my hands inside my pockets. My fingers brushed against a small, smooth stone I'd picked up from Grandpa's garden the day he died. It was grounding. It reminded me of the Sunday afternoons I spent making him tea while Julian and Vanessa sent sincere apologies via their assistants because they were too busy for a slow old man. I had been the one to change his linens. I had been the one to read him the poetry he loved when his eyesight failed. I had been the one to hold his hand as the rhythm of his breathing grew shallow and finally stopped. I didn't care about the money. I just wanted one last piece of him that didn't feel like a mockery. "Shall we begin?" Mr. Henderson asked. He opened the briefcase and pulled out 3 envelopes in a small, heavy wooden box. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "To my eldest, Julian," Mr. Henderson read, his voice steady, "you have always known a man who knows the value of a dollar, but rarely the value of a hand. You complained that my home was cluttered with things that didn't turn a profit. Therefore, I leave you my collection of vintage newspapers from the year 1954. You always said history was for people who couldn't handle the future. Now you can see what the world looked like before you decided you owned it." Julian's face went from smug to a sickly shade of gray. "Newspapers? Is this a joke? The man was worth $20 million in liquid assets alone." "And to my daughter, Vanessa," Mr. Henderson continued, ignoring the outburst, "you spent your life looking in mirrors and wondering why the world wasn't a reflection of your beauty. You called my garden a patch of weeds. I leave you my collection of dried pressed flowers and my old gardening shears. Use them to cultivate something that doesn't require a filter to look alive." Vanessa ripped the envelope from the lawyer's hand, her face contorting in a mask of fury. "Pressed flowers? I spent 3 Christmases at that nursing home. Well, I sent the most expensive lilies every year. This is senility. This will be contested." Then Mr. Henderson looked at me. The air seemed to grow still. The rain felt warmer, or maybe that was just the blood rushing to my face. "And to Clara," he said softly, "my black sheep, the only one who knew that a sheep is only black because it refuses to blend into a flock of shadows. Clara, you gave me your time when I had nothing else to offer. You gave me your heart when everyone else was looking for my wallet." He reached into the wooden box and pulled out a single heavy iron key. It was rusted at the edges, ornate and ancient, looking more like something from a fairy tale than a modern bank. "He leaves you this key," he said, placing it in my palm, "and a note." He handed me a small piece of yellowed stationery. My hand shook as I unfolded it. It was Grandpa's handwriting, spidery, elegant, and firm. "Clara, my dear girl, they will tell you this is worthless. They will laugh at the rest. But you have always known that the most beautiful things are hidden behind the heaviest doors. Go to the old boathouse on the north side of the lake, the one they told me to tear down. Use this, and remember, the inheritance isn't what I leave you, it's what I kept for you." Julian stepped over, snatching the note from my hand before I could protest. He read it, his lip curling in disdain. "A key to a dilapidated shack? A boathouse that's literally rotting into the water?" He tossed the note back at me, his eyes full of a bitter, poisonous triumph. "Congratulations, Clara. You spent 10 years playing nursemaid and got a rusty piece of metal and a pile of damp wood. I guess we're all losers today." "At least our lawyers can fix our mess," Vanessa hissed, snapping her umbrella shut. "This will is a farce. He wasn't in his right mind. But you, Clara, you actually look happy. You were always pathetic. Enjoy your shack." They turned their backs on me, their expensive shoes clicking loudly on the pavement as they marched toward their waiting town cars, leaving me standing alone in the rain. I looked down at the key. It felt heavy. It felt intentional. And for the first time in years, I felt like Grandpa was still standing right beside me, whispering for me to keep walking. I watched their cars disappear behind the curtain of mist and rain, the red taillights fading like dying embers. For a long time, I just stood there. The silence of the park felt different now, heavy, but not lonely. I looked down at the key in my hand. It was cold, smelling of old iron and damp cellars, but it felt like a promise. My siblings, Julian and Vanessa, had always measured life in spreadsheets and square footage. To them, I was the black sheep, not because I was rebellious or cruel, but because I was unproductive. In our family, if you weren't multiplying your wealth, you were subtracting from the family's dignity. I remembered a dinner, maybe 5 years ago, at a restaurant where the menus didn't have prices and the waiters moved like shadows. It was Grandpa Silas's 80th birthday. Julian had just closed a deal that made him a few $1,000,000, and Vanessa had just been featured in a top 30 under 30 list for her PR firm. "And how is the art therapy going, Clara?" Vanessa had asked, swirling a glass of wine that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She said art therapy, the way someone describes a toddler's finger painting. "It's good," I had replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "One of my students, a little girl named Maya, finally spoke for the first time in months through her drawings. It felt like a miracle." Julian had chuckled, a dry, metallic sound. "Miracles don't pay the mortgage, Clara. You're 32. You're still living in that studio apartment above the bakery. Don't you think it's time to stop finding yourself and start building something that lasts? You're the only one in this family who isn't contributing to the legacy." Grandpa Silas had been quiet that night, picking at his sea bass, but I felt his foot nudge mine under the table. When I looked at him, he gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible wink. "Legacy isn't always built in stone and steel, Julian," he'd said softly. "Sometimes it's built in the things people forget to look at." Now, standing in the rain, those words echoed in my mind. I walked back to my old beat-up sedan. The engine groaned as I turned the key, a stark contrast to the silent hum of my siblings' luxury vehicles. I drove toward the north side of the lake, a part of town that had been bypassed by the recent wave of gentrification. It was where the old summer homes sat, many of them shuttered and graying, leaning into the shoreline like tired old men. The boathouse was tucked away at the end of a long, overgrown gravel drive. Grandpa had bought it back in the 60s, a small cedar-shingled structure that sat on stilts over the dark water. Julian had tried to convince Grandpa to sell the land to a developer a dozen times. "It's an eyesore, Silas," he'd say. "Tear it down, put up a modern pier, and we can triple the land value." But Grandpa had held on. He'd tell them the foundation was too weak for new construction or that the permits were tied up in red tape. He'd made it seem like a burden, a piece of worthless property he was just too stubborn to let go of. As I pulled up, the gravel crunching under my tires, I saw the boathouse through the trees. It looked exactly as I remembered, the green paint peeling like sunburned skin, the windows clouded with salt and grime. It looked like a place where secrets went to sleep. I climbed out of the car, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The air here smelled of pine needles and the sharp, fishy tang of the lake. I walked down the narrow wooden walkway, the boards creaking and groaning under my weight. I reached the heavy oak door and looked at the lock. It was a massive, old-fashioned deadbolt, thick with layers of rust. I slid the iron key into the hole. It resisted at first, the metal grinding against metal. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and whispered, "Okay, Grandpa, I'm here." With a sudden, sharp clack, the lock turned. The door swung open with a heavy, protesting moan. I stepped inside, and for a moment I couldn't see anything. The air was cool and still, smelling of sawdust, old oil, and something else, something sweet like dried lavender. I fumbled for the light switch by the door, not even sure if the electricity was still connected. I flipped it, and a single naked bulb overhead flickered to life, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. The boathouse wasn't empty. It wasn't a dilapidated shack inside. It was a workshop. Against the far wall stood a massive workbench cluttered with wood planes, chisels, and jars of varnish. In the center of the room, draped in a heavy canvas tarp, was a large rectangular object. But what caught my eye were the walls. They were covered in paintings. I walked closer, my breath catching in my throat. They weren't just any paintings. They were mine, sketches I'd thrown away in college, watercolors I'd gifted him for his birthdays over the last 15 years, canvases I thought had been lost in my move 5 years ago. He had framed them all, every single one, in beautiful hand-carved wooden frames. But there were other paintings, too. Landscapes of the lake I didn't recognize, bold, vibrant oils of the city at night, and in the corner of each one was a signature I knew well, but had never seen on a canvas. S. Sterling, Grandpa Silas. He was an artist. The man who Julian and Vanessa called a cold, pragmatic businessman had spent his private hours painting the world he wasn't allowed to show them. Tears pricked my eyes as I realized why he'd kept this place. This wasn't a shack. It was his sanctuary. It was the only place where he could be the black sheep he truly was. I walked over to the center of the room and reached for the edge of the canvas tarp. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely grip the heavy fabric. I pulled it back, and the dust rose in a golden cloud in the light of the single bulb. Underneath the tarp wasn't a boat. It was a massive, antique roll-top desk crafted from dark, gleaming mahogany. It looked out of place in the rustic workshop, like a king sitting in a carpenter's hut. On top of the desk sat a small brass plaque that read, "For the one who sees what is hidden." I tried to lift the roll top, but it was locked. I looked at the key in my hand, the one from the park. It was too large for the desk's delicate lock. I frowned, looking around the room, my mind racing. "The inheritance isn't what I leave you, it's what I kept for you," the note had said. I began to search the workshop. I looked under the workbench, behind the paintings, inside the jars of old nails. My frustration grew. Was this it? A hidden hobby? A collection of my own failed art? I loved him for it, I truly did, but I could already hear Julian's voice in my head, mocking me for finding a room full of trash. I sat down on a stool, burying my face in my hands. "Grandpa, what am I missing?" I whispered. I looked back at the desk. I noticed something strange about the brass plaque. It wasn't perfectly centered. I reached out and touched it, and to my surprise, it shifted. It was a sliding mechanism. I pushed it to the right, and a small secret compartment clicked open behind the plaque. Inside was a second key, a small silver one. I took the silver key and inserted it into the roll top. It turned with a silky smoothness. I pushed the top up, and as the desk opened, a scent of old paper and cedar wafted out. The desk was filled with ledgers, dozens of them, but they weren't business ledgers. I opened the first one. It was a diary. July 14th, 1998, the first entry read. "Julian asked me today why I don't buy the skyscraper on Fifth Avenue. I told him the shadows were too long there. He looked at me like I was speaking a dead language. He only sees the height. He doesn't see the dark. Clara came over today and showed me a drawing of a bird with a broken wing. She asked if the bird was sad. I told her the bird was just waiting for the wind to change. She understood. She is the only one who ever does." I felt a sob rise in my chest. I flipped through the pages, seeing my name appearing again and again. He had documented my life, my struggles, and my failures with a tenderness that I had never felt from anyone else. But then I reached the back of the desk. There was a thick, legal-sized envelope with my name on it in bold black ink. It was sealed with red wax. I broke the seal and pulled out a stack of documents. My eyes scanned the first page, and I felt the world tilt on its axis. It was a deed, not to the boathouse, not to the lake. It was a deed to a private trust, the Sterling Legacy Fund. I turned the page to the asset list. I saw numbers that made my head spin. Account after account, stocks, bonds, and real estate holdings, none of which had been mentioned in the public will Henderson had read in the park. And then I saw the letter attached to the deed. "Clara, if you are reading this, you have found the workshop. You have found the part of me I had to hide to survive the world your father and siblings created. They want the liquid assets. They want the things they can count and brag about. So I gave them the scraps, the newspapers, the shears. They are mirrors, Clara. I wanted them to see themselves in what I left them. But you?" For the next 7 days, I lived in 2 different worlds. In one world, I was still Clara, the woman who wore thrift store cardigans and worried about whether the community center's radiator would hold out through the winter. I still taught my classes, watching my students' faces light up when they mixed the perfect shade of sunset orange. But in the other world, the one that lived inside the rusted iron key in my pocket, I was the steward of a legacy so vast it felt heavy, like carrying a mountain in my palm. I spent my evenings back at the boathouse. I didn't touch the money. I didn't call a bank or a financial advisor. Instead, I cleaned. I wiped 40 years of dust off Grandpa's paintings. I polished the dark mahogany of the desk until it glowed like a dark mirror. I brought a small kerosene heater to take the chill out of the air, and the smell of the fuel mixed with the scent of old wood and lavender. It was during those quiet nights that I realized why Grandpa had chosen this place. In the city, in those glass offices where Julian and Vanessa spent their days, everything was about the now. It was about the next quarterly report, the next trend, the next acquisition. But here, by the water, everything was about the always. The lake didn't care about stock prices. The trees didn't care about social status. On Wednesday, my phone buzzed on the workbench. It was Vanessa. "Clara," she said, her voice sounding like she was talking to a difficult child. "We're worried about you. Mr. Henderson said you've been spending all your time at that structure." "It's a boathouse, Vanessa," I said, my voice calmer than it had ever been. "It's a hazard is what it is," she snapped. "Look, we've decided to be generous. Julian has a developer friend who wants the lakefront lot. Even with that shack on it, he's willing to give us a few $100,000. If you sign over your interest, we'll give you a 10% finder's fee. It's more than you'll make in 5 years of teaching." I looked at the painting in front of me, a vibrant oil of a storm breaking over the lake. "I'm not interested in selling, Vanessa." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Don't be a martyr, Clara. You're being selfish. That land is part of the family estate, and you're letting it rot because of some misguided sentimentality. You're proving exactly why Grandpa didn't trust you with the real assets." "Grandpa left me exactly what he wanted me to have," I replied. "And actually, I was going to call you. I'd like you and Julian to come to the boathouse on Saturday morning at 10. I want to show you what I found." Vanessa laughed, a cold, brittle sound. "What? A particularly interesting piece of driftwood? A nest of spiders? Clara, we don't have time for a tour of your garbage." "Please," I said, leaning into the word. "It's about Grandpa's legacy. If you come and you still want me to sign the papers afterward, I'll consider it." That was the bait. The idea that they could finally squeeze that last bit of value out of the black sheep was too much for them to resist. "Fine," she hissed. 10 o'clock, but don't expect us to stay for tea." The rest of the week was a blur of preparation. I went to see Mr. Henderson at his office, a space filled with old paper and the ticking of a grandfather clock that sounded like a heartbeat. He didn't look surprised to see me. He simply slid a fountain pen across the desk. "Your grandfather knew you'd find it quickly," Henderson said, his eyes twinkling behind his spectacles. "He used to say that Julian and Vanessa would look for a safe with a keypad, but Clara would look for the story." "Is it really all mine?" I asked, looking at the numbers on the trust documents. "Legally, yes. Morally, that's for you to decide. The Sterling Legacy Fund wasn't just built on money, Clara. It was built on the assets Silas took out of the family business every time he felt his children were becoming too greedy. He called it his karma tax. He wanted the money to go to someone who knew that wealth is a tool, not a trophy." I signed the papers. My hand didn't shake this time. Saturday morning arrived with a crisp, biting wind. The rain had stopped, but the sky was the color of a bruised plum. I arrived at the boathouse early. I dressed in my usual clothes, jeans, a thick sweater, and my old boots. I wanted them to see the Clara they thought they knew. I set up 3 chairs in the center of the workshop, facing the desk and the paintings. I didn't hide anything, but I didn't highlight the wealth either. The ledgers were stacked neatly on the desk. The secret compartment was closed. At precisely 10 o'clock, I heard the crunch of gravel. Not 1 car, but 2. Julian's silver sports car and Vanessa's white SUV. They stepped out of their vehicles like they were stepping on an alien planet, their designer clothes stark against the rugged, unkempt landscape. Julian was on his phone, barking orders to someone, while Vanessa kicked her way across the gravel in heels that were entirely inappropriate for the mud. "This is ridiculous," Julian said, as he stepped onto the wooden walkway, the boards groaning under his weight. "Clara, if this is some kind of emotional healing exercise, I'm leaving in 5 minutes." "Just come inside, Julian," I said, holding the door open. They stepped into the workshop. I watched their eyes. They didn't look at the art. They didn't look at the craftsmanship of the mahogany desk. They looked at the dust motes dancing in the light. They looked at the peeling paint on the walls. "God, it smells like a garage in here," Vanessa said, pressing a silk handkerchief to her nose. "So, this is it? This is your big reveal? A bunch of old frames and some wood shavings?" "Look at the paintings, Vanessa," I said softly. Julian walked over to the wall, glancing at a landscape. S. Sterling? Silas painted these? What a waste of time! He could have been overseeing the merger in Dubai, and he was out here playing with brushes. No wonder the company's growth slowed in the 90s. He turned to me, his face hardening. "Clara, we've brought the papers. The developer is offering $400,000 for the lot. We've already split the shares, $200 for me, $200 for Vanessa. We'll give you $50,000 just to go away and stop being an embarrassment. That's more than fair for a black sheep who contributed 0 to the family coffers." I looked at the papers Julian was holding out. They were crisp, white, and cold. "Is that all you see here? $400,000? It's the only thing of value in this entire square mile," Vanessa snapped. "Clara, look at yourself. You're living in a dream world. Grandpa was a businessman who went soft in the head at the end. He left us newspapers and gardening shears as a final middle finger because we actually wanted to run the business properly. He left you this dump because he knew you'd be happy with nothing. Now, sign the papers so we can move on." I walked over to the mahogany desk. I ran my hand over the smooth wood. "You're right about one thing, Vanessa. Grandpa did leave you those things as a mirror. He wanted to see if you'd look past the surface. He wanted to see if you'd value the history in those newspapers or the growth in those shears." Julian rolled his eyes. "Spare us the philosophy. Are you signing or not?" I looked at them, my brother and sister. They were my blood, but we were separated by an ocean of understanding. I felt a wave of sadness wash over me, but underneath it was a cold, hard diamond of resolve. "I'm not signing," I said, "because I don't own 1/3 of this land, Julian. I own all of it." Vanessa let out a sharp laugh. "The will said—" "The public will was only the beginning," I interrupted. I reached for the silver key and inserted it into the desk. I pulled the roll top back with a slow, deliberate motion. I picked up the stack of trust documents, the ones with the Sterling Legacy Fund seal. "Grandpa had a private trust," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "It holds 80% of his total wealth. The houses, the international accounts, the silent shares in the firm you think you run. All of it was moved into this trust 10 years ago." The room went deadly silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. Julian stepped forward, his hand reaching for the documents. I didn't pull them back. I let him see the numbers. I let him see the signatures. I watched as the color drained from his face. I watched as Vanessa's hand, still holding the silk handkerchief, began to tremble. "This can't be right," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. "This is billions. This is the entire backbone of the company." "And it's all managed by the Sterling Legacy Fund," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "And the sole trustee is the black sheep." The only sound in the boathouse was the rhythmic, hollow slapping of the lake water against the wooden stilts beneath us. It sounded like a ticking clock, marking the seconds of a world that had just ended for Julian and Vanessa. Julian's hand was still hovering over the mahogany desk, his fingers twitching. He looked at the trust documents as if they were a coiled snake. His breathing had become shallow, a sharp contrast to the arrogant, booming voice he'd used just moments ago. "This is a forgery," he finally choked out. His voice was thin, reedy. "It has to be. Silas wouldn't. He couldn't. I've been the one running the day-to-day. I've been the one protecting the Sterling name while he sat in this shed." "He didn't want the name protected, Julian," I said, my voice as steady as the deep water outside. "He wanted the soul protected, and he knew that as long as you and Vanessa had the keys to the vault, the soul was for sale." Vanessa stepped forward, her heels clicking aggressively on the dusty floorboards. The mask of the concerned sister had completely vanished, replaced by a jagged, raw desperation. "You've been planning this," she hissed, her eyes darting around the workshop as if searching for a hidden camera. "You played the sweet, dutiful granddaughter. You spent those nights at his bedside, whispering in his ear, poisoning him against us, while we were out actually working to keep this family afloat. You're not a black sheep, Clara. You're a parasite." I looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the familiar sting of her insults. I didn't feel the need to defend my character or explain my choices. I felt a strange, quiet pity. "I didn't have to poison his mind, Vanessa. You did that yourselves. Every time you ignored his calls because you were at a gallery opening, every time you talked about putting him in a facility while he was still sitting right in front of you. He didn't see a parasite when he looked at me. He saw a person, something both of you stopped being a long time ago." Julian suddenly lunged for the papers, his face contorted with a frantic sort of greed, but I was faster. I didn't grab them. I simply leaned my weight against the roll-top desk, and it slid shut with a heavy, final thud. "Don't," I said. It wasn't a scream. It was a command. Julian stopped, his chest heaving. He looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Fear. Not fear of me, but fear of the void. Without the money, without the sterling power, he was just a middle-aged man in an expensive suit standing in the mud. "What do you want, Clara? Money? You want us to beg? Fine, you win. Tell us the price for you to tear those papers up and let the original will stand." "There is no price, Julian. The trust is irrevocable. It's done," I replied. "But there is a secondary document, one Grandpa called the character clause." I reached into the desk's side drawer and pulled out a smaller blue-bound folder. This was the part of the plan that I'd spent the last 3 nights rereading and marveling at the intricate, brilliant trap Grandpa had set. "According to the trust," I opened the folder, "Julian, your position as CEO of Sterling Holdings is not a birthright. It is a colonial appointment. The trust, which I now control, holds the voting majority. Your salary, your bonuses, even your access to the company jet, it's all subject to the approval of the trustee." Julian's face went from pale to a deep bruised purple. "You're going to fire me from my own company?" "No," I said. "Grandpa didn't want the company to fail. He wanted it to change. He's left a list of requirements. The company must divest from the predatory real estate projects you've been pushing. It must establish a massive scholarship fund for the arts and community development. And your compensation, well, it's being capped at exactly the same amount as a public school teacher's salary." Julian let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "You're insane! I can't live on that. My mortgage alone is—" "Then sell the house, Julian, or find another job. But if you want to stay at Sterling, you'll work for the people, not for the profit." Vanessa was shaking now, her designer handbag clutched so tight the leather was creaking. "And me? What did he do to me?" "The PR firm you run, Vanessa, it's funded by a line of credit from the Sterling estate. That line of credit is being frozen as of this morning. Unless," I paused, looking at her, "unless you pivot the firm's focus. No more crisis management for corrupt politicians, no more burying the truth for a paycheck. You will use your talents to represent nonprofits and whistleblowers. If you do, the trust will continue to fund you. If you don't, you'll be looking for a desk at a temp agency by Monday." Vanessa let out a sharp, jagged cry. "He's reaching from the grave to destroy us. He's using you as a weapon to take everything we worked for." "You didn't work for it, Vanessa." I walked toward the window and looked out at the gray, churning water of the lake. "You inherited an opportunity and you turned it into a weapon. Grandpa just took the weapon away and gave you back the opportunity. He's not destroying you. He's giving you a chance to be the people you were before the money blinded you." "We'll sue," Julian spat, regaining some of his venom. "We'll tie you up in court for 20 years. We'll prove he was senile, that you coerced him." "Mr. Henderson has the video files, Julian," I said, turning back to them. "Hours of them. Grandpa sat in his study month after month explaining exactly why he was doing this. He had 3 different psychiatric evaluations on the same day he signed the trust. He was more lucid than you are right now. If you sue, you'll lose, and the trust has a no contest clause. If you challenge and lose, you're stripped of even the scraps from the public will. You'll have the newspapers and the gardening shears, and absolutely nothing else." The silence returned, heavier this time. Julian and Vanessa looked at each other, and for the first time in my life, I saw them truly united. But it wasn't a union of love, it was a union of defeat. They realized then that they weren't in a boathouse, they were in a courtroom, and the judge had already left the building. Julian slumped into one of the chairs I'd set out. He looked smaller somehow. The sharp lines of his suit seemed too big for him. Vanessa just stood there, staring at a painting on the wall, one I'd done when I was 19. It was a simple sketch of Grandpa Silas sitting on the park bench, looking at the water. "He really loved you, didn't he?" she asked, her voice devoid of its usual edge. It was almost a whisper. "He loved all of us," I said softly, "but he knew that love looks like a hug to some people and a boundary to others. This trust is his boundary for you." "Get out," Julian said, his head in his hands. "Actually, Julian," I picked up my keys in the blue folder, "this is my boathouse and my land. You're the ones who are leaving." I walked to the door and opened it wide. The wind rushed in, cold and fresh, clearing out the smell of stale perfume and expensive cologne. They didn't move at first. They sat in the silence of their own choices. Then slowly, Julian stood up. He didn't look at me as he walked past. He looked like a man walking toward a long, cold winter. Vanessa followed him, her head bowed, her heels clicking a much slower, much humbler rhythm on the wooden boards. I watched them walk down the gravel path. They didn't speak to each other. They got into their separate cars and drove away, the sound of their engines fading into the rustle of the trees. I stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the ripples on the lake. I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and peace. The black sheep had finally been given the shepherd's staff, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the responsibility. But as I looked back at the workshop, at the paintings and the mahogany desk, I realized that the real work hadn't even begun yet. I had billions of dollars, a legacy to reshape, and a family to heal. From a distance. I sat down at Grandpa's workbench and picked up a piece of charcoal. I began to draw. Not a bird with a broken wing this time. I drew the lake, the way the light was starting to break through the plum-colored clouds. I was Clara Sterling, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving the family legacy. I was creating it. The weeks that followed were a blur of beige law offices, heavy velvet curtains, and the sharp, rhythmic clicking of stamps on legal documents. If the first part of my journey was a private storm in a boathouse, the second part was a public sunrise, one that cast a long, unforgiving light on the cracks in the Sterling Empire. The transition of power didn't happen in a single dramatic moment. It was a slow tide. Per Grandpa Silas's instructions, Mr. Henderson released a formal press statement 3 weeks after the boathouse meeting. It didn't mention the family drama or the black sheep narrative. It simply announced the activation of the Sterling Legacy Fund and the appointment of its sole trustee, Clara Sterling. The reaction was immediate. My phone, which usually only rang for my landlord or the occasional telemarketer, became a glowing, vibrating source of anxiety. Friends I hadn't heard from since high school suddenly missed me and wanted to grab coffee. Distant cousins I didn't know existed sent long, flowery emails about the importance of family unity. But the most profound change was at Sterling Holdings. Julian didn't quit. I knew he wouldn't. To Julian, leaving the company was a kind of death, even if his office now felt like a prison. I'll never forget our first official board meeting. I didn't sit at the head of the table. I sat in a chair near the window, wearing the same thrift store cardigan I'd worn to the park. The board members, men and women who looked like they were carved out of granite, looked at me with a mixture of terror and curiosity. Julian sat at the table, his knuckles white as he gripped his pen. His expensive silk tie seemed to be choking him. "The trustee has the floor," Mr. Henderson announced. I stood up. My voice didn't shake. "I'm not here to run this company into the ground," I said, looking at each of them, "and I'm not here to play at being a CEO. My grandfather spent 40 years building this foundation, but he spent the last 10 years watching it crumble from the inside. We are no longer a company that measures success by how many people we can push out of their homes for a luxury high-rise. We are now a company that measures success by how many homes we can build for the people who actually live in this city." I laid out the first project, the conversion of a massive, stalled luxury condo project downtown, one of Julian's crown jewels, into a mixed-income community center and low-interest housing for artists and teachers. The silence in the room was deafening. One of the older board members, a man who had been with the firm since before I was born, cleared his throat. "Miss Sterling, the profit margins on such a pivot are negligible. The shareholders? The majority shareholder is the Sterling Legacy Fund, and the fund is satisfied with the margin of human impact. As for the rest of the board, if you find this direction incompatible with your personal financial goals, your resignations will be accepted with full honors and the standard severance. But the work starts on Monday." Julian stood up abruptly, his chair screeching against the marble floor. "You're doing this to spite me," he hissed, his voice echoing in the grand room. "You're throwing away a billion-dollar opportunity just to prove you can." "No, Julian," I said, meeting his gaze. "I'm doing this because for 30 years you threw away the family's integrity to prove you could. I'm just balancing the books." He walked out. It was the first of many times he would walk out of a room I was in. But he stayed with the company. He took the pay cut, he took the teacher's salary, and I heard through the office grapevine that he had to sell his collection of vintage sports cars just to keep up with the taxes on his estate. Part of me felt a twinge of the old guilt, the black sheep wanting to make everyone happy. But then I remembered the boathouse. I remembered the newspapers Grandpa left him. You always said history was for people who couldn't handle the future. Julian was finally living in the present. Vanessa's reckoning was different. Her PR firm didn't collapse, but it withered. When the line of credit from the estate was frozen, she tried to bluff her way through, taking on even more high-paying, morally questionable clients. But word got out. In the world of high-stakes PR, your reputation is your currency. And when the world realized that the grande dame of Sterling PR no longer had the Sterling checkbook behind her, the sharks started to circle. She called me one night, 6 months into the transition. Her voice was slurred, the clink of ice against glass audible over the line. "Are you happy now, Clara?" she whispered, sitting in an office that's half empty. My best friends won't return my texts. I had to let my assistant go today. She was the only person I talked to most weeks. I'm not happy that you're hurting, Vanessa, I said, sitting on the small balcony of my new apartment, a modest place but filled with light and plants. But I am hopeful. You're finally in a position where you have to be honest. You have to decide who you are when you're not Vanessa Sterling, the power player. I don't know who that is, she sobbed. I don't think she exists. She does, I said. She's the girl who used to draw pressed flowers in the margins of her notebooks before she decided beauty was a commodity. Go find her. The fund is still here, Vanessa. If you choose to use your voice for something that matters, the door is open. She hung up without saying goodbye, but a week later I received a small package in the mail. It was a single pressed violet in a simple glass frame. No note, just the flower. As for me, the public consequence was the death of my anonymity. I couldn't go to the bakery downstairs without someone recognizing me from the local news. I couldn't teach my art classes in the same way. The power dynamic had shifted. So I did what Grandpa would have done. I didn't build a mansion. I didn't buy a private island. I went back to the community center, the drafty one where I used to teach. I didn't just fund it, I bought the entire block. I turned it into the Silas Sterling Arts and Healing Center. I hired the best teachers, bought the best supplies, and made sure that every child in the neighborhood, regardless of their parents' bank account, had a place to sit and draw a bird with a broken wing. The biggest consequence was internal. I remember sitting in the center's new garden one evening. The smell of blooming jasmine was heavy in the air, mixed with the damp, earthy scent of the lake nearby. I looked at my hands. They were covered in charcoal and blue paint. I was a billionaire, a trustee, a power player in my own right. But I realized that I didn't feel like any of those things. I felt like Clara, just Clara. I had spent my whole life thinking the black sheep label was a brand of shame. I thought it meant I was flawed, that I was the broken link in a golden chain. But as I watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of violet and gold, I realized that being the black sheep was the only thing that had saved me. It was the black sheep who had stayed behind to hold Grandpa's hand. It was the black sheep who had listened to his stories instead of counting his money. I pulled a small silver key from my pocket, the one to the roll-top desk. I didn't need it to open the desk anymore. The desk was in my study now. I kept it as a reminder. Justice isn't always about a gavel or a prison cell. Sometimes justice is just a mirror. It's giving people exactly what they asked for and letting them live with it. Julian asked for power, so I gave him a job where he had to use power for good. Vanessa asked for status, so I gave her a status that had to be earned. And Grandpa? Grandpa asked for a legacy. I looked up at the new sign above the center's entrance. It didn't say Sterling Holdings. It said the Sterling Heart. I felt a cool breeze off the water, and for a moment I could swear I smelled the faint, sweet scent of Grandpa's pipe tobacco. I closed my eyes and smiled. The black sheep was finally home, and the flock, well, the flock was finally learning how to fly. A year has passed since that rainy afternoon in the park, and yet, in many ways, it feels like a lifetime. Time is a strange thing. When you're struggling to make rent and keep your head above water, it moves like sludge. But when you're building something, when you're pouring your soul into a purpose that's larger than yourself, it flies by like the white-winged gulls over the lake. I went back to the boathouse today. I try to come here at least once a month. I don't come to look at the ledgers or to check on the mahogany desk, though it's still here, polished and proud. I come for the silence. I come to remember the girl who walked down this gravel path with nothing but a rusted iron key and a heart full of grief. The workshop has changed a little. I've added more light, and the walls are now lined with art from the children at the center. There's a painting by a 7-year-old boy named Leo that hangs right next to one of Grandpa's landscapes. It's a mess of bright yellows and erratic blues, a sunshine explosion, he called it. Grandpa would have loved it. He would have seen the courage in those messy strokes. My relationship with my siblings is quiet. That's the best word for it. Julian is still at the firm. He still wears his expensive suits, and he still carries himself with a certain rigid dignity. But the fire of his arrogance has been replaced by a flickering lantern of duty. He doesn't look for the shallows anymore. He looks at the blueprints for the affordable housing units we're breaking ground on next spring. We don't have Sunday dinners, and we probably never will, but he sent me a card on my birthday. It didn't say much, just, "Happy birthday, Clara. The foundations for the 4th Street project are solid." For Julian, that's as close to "I love you" as he can get. And for now, I've learned that it's enough. Vanessa took the longest to find her footing. She left the city for 6 months, disappearing into a small town in the mountains. When she came back, she didn't reopen her PR firm. She started a small consulting group that helps nonprofits craft their stories. She looks different now. Her hair isn't perfectly coiffed, and she wears comfortable shoes. Last week, she stopped by the boathouse. We sat on the wooden pier, our legs dangling over the water, watching the sunset. "I used to hate this place," she said, her voice soft, mixing with the gentle lap of the waves. "I thought it was a tomb for Grandpa's ambition. I didn't realize it was a nursery for his hope." I looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see a rival. I saw a sister. "He just wanted us to see the world without the price tags, Vanessa." She nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the light dust on her cheek. "I'm learning, Clara. It's a slow process, unlearning how to be superior, but I think I like the view from down here a lot better." We sat in silence for a long time after that. We didn't talk about the money. We didn't talk about the black sheep years. We just watched the light change on the water. Healing isn't a destination. It's not a place you arrive at where everything is suddenly perfect and the scars disappear. Healing is the act of walking. It's the decision to take the next step, even when your boots are heavy with mud and the path is overgrown with the weeds of the past. I've realized that Grandpa Silas didn't just leave me a fortune. He didn't just leave me a weapon to use against my siblings. He left me the freedom to be exactly who I already was. He protected the part of me that the world and my own family had tried to crush. He knew that the only way to save a family like ours wasn't to give us more, but to take away the things that were making us sick. I stood up and walked to the end of the pier. The air was cool, smelling of pine and the deep, clean scent of the lake. I reached into my pocket and felt the 2 keys, the old iron one and the small silver one. They were warm from my skin. They call me a philanthropist now. They call me a visionary. They call me a power player. But when I look in the mirror, I don't see any of those titles. I see a woman who was brave enough to stay behind when everyone else was running towards the gold. I see a woman who found wealth in a rusted lock in a room full of worthless paintings. I looked out at the horizon where the plum-colored sky was meeting the dark water. I felt a profound sense of gratitude, not for the millions in the trust, but for the moments of quiet connection I now get to witness every day. I thought of Maya, finally speaking through her art. I thought of the teachers who no longer have to work 3 jobs to stay in the neighborhood they love. I thought of the black sheep of the world, finally realizing that their color isn't a flaw, it's a badge of honor. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs with a sense of possibility. Grandpa Silas was gone, but his heart was beating in every brushstroke, every new home, and every honest conversation I had. I turned back towards the boathouse, the single light in the window casting a golden path across the gravel. It was time to go home. The story of the Sterling family isn't over, but for the first time in generations, it's being written in a hand that knows the value of a heart. As I sit here today sharing this story with you, I'm reminded of a question my grandfather once asked me when I was just a little girl. We were sitting on that same park bench, and he asked me, "Clara, if you found a box that could only be opened by someone who had nothing to lose, would you have the courage to try the lock?" Back then, I didn't understand what he meant. I do now. Sometimes being the black sheep is the greatest gift you can receive. It's the world's way of letting you walk your own path, away from the expectations and the greed that can so easily consume a life. It allows you to see the worthless things for what they truly are, the only things that actually matter. So, I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt like the outsider in your own family? Have you ever been told that your passions were a waste of time or that your value was measured by your bank account? And more importantly, if you were given the power to settle the score, would you choose revenge or would you choose to build a longer table? Tell me your stories in the comments. I read every single one, and they remind me that we are all, in our own ways, searching for the key to something real. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who might feel like a black sheep themselves. Remember, the inheritance isn't always what's left for you. Sometimes it's what you keep for yourself. Until next time, stay kind, stay brave, and keep looking for the beauty in the things others ignore. This has been Voices of Auntie May. Take care of yourselves and each other. Evelyn Vance didn't live in a penthouse. She lived in a converted brownstone in a part of the city where the trees actually turned orange in the fall instead of just dropping their leaves in exhaustion. When I arrived, the rain had returned, a soft, persistent mist that made the cobblestones gleam like the scales of a sleeping dragon. I rang the bell, my heart doing that nervous, fluttering dance it always did when I was about to walk into a room where I didn't belong. But the door didn't open to a receptionist or a security guard. It opened to Evelyn herself. She was a woman who looked like she was carved out of cedar, sturdy, weathered, and possessing a natural, understated elegance. She wore a simple navy cardigan and spectacles that hung from a silver chain around her neck. Her hair was a shock of snowy white, pinned back in a sensible bun. "You have your mother's eyes, Clara," she said, before even saying hello. "But you have Silas's jaw. Come in, the tea is just starting to whistle." The inside of her home smelled like old paper, beeswax, and dried mint. It was the antithesis of the cold glass and steel offices Julian frequented. Here, books were stacked on every available surface, and the walls were covered in framed photographs of people who looked like they'd fought hard lives and won. "Grandpa mentioned you in his diary," I said, sitting at a small, round kitchen table that had seen a lot of history. "He said you were the only one who could help me handle what's coming." Evelyn poured the tea, the steam rising in a fragrant cloud. "Silas and I were friends long before he was a titan of industry, Clara. We were both just kids from the docks who thought we could change the world. He did it with money, I did it with the law. But we both knew the same truth. Power is like water. If you don't direct it, it just rots the foundation." She sat down across from me, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "I've seen the headlines, Clara. Your brother is using Marcus Thorne. Marcus is a man who would sue his own shadow for blocking his light. They aren't trying to win a legal case. They're trying to break your spirit so you'll sign that settlement. Tell me, why haven't you?" I looked down at the dark amber liquid in my cup. "Because if I sign, the money just goes back into a cycle of greed. Grandpa called it his karma tax. He wanted it to go to things that matter. If I walk away, I'm not just losing a trust, I'm letting down everyone he spent 40 years trying to protect. Evelyn smiled, a small, genuine thing that crinkled the corners of her eyes. Good. Then we have a starting point. Now, let's talk about the deposition on Thursday. Marcus is going to try to paint you as a caretaker turned con artist. He's going to ask you about every penny you ever borrowed from Silas. He's going to bring up your art school transcripts, your rent history, even your grocery bills. He wants to make you look desperate. I was desperate. I worked 3 jobs just to keep my studio. I ate ramen for a year so I could buy oil paints. Is that a crime? To people who have never known hunger, desperation looks like motive. But we're not going to play his game, Clara. We're not going to defend your past. We're going to expose their present. She pulled a thick file from a shelf behind her. It was labeled Sterling Holdings Internal Audit. Silas gave me this 6 months ago, Clara. He knew Julian was cooking the books on those luxury developments. He knew Vanessa was using family funds to cover the losses in her PR firm. He didn't stop them then because he wanted the paper trail to be undeniable. He didn't just want to cut them off, he wanted to give you the leverage to force them to be better. I opened the file, my eyes scanning the rows of numbers and red-stamped overdue notices. My heart sunk as I realized the scale of the deception. Julian hadn't just been arrogant, he'd been reckless. He'd been gambling with the company's future to maintain the illusion of his own success. On Thursday, Evelyn continued, Marcus will ask you a question, and instead of answering it with a defense, you're going to answer it with a question of your own. You're going to ask him about the Starlight Initiative, a shell company Julian created to hide $40 million of debt. I'm not a shark, Evelyn, I said, feeling a wave of nausea. I don't want to destroy them. You're not destroying them, Clara. You're holding up a mirror. What they do with what they see is up to them, but you cannot lead the Sterling Legacy Fund if you are under the thumb of their blackmail. You have to clear the air before you can build the garden. The next few days were a blur of intense preparation. Evelyn didn't just teach me the law, she taught me how to breathe. She taught me how to sit in a room full of people who hated me and remember that my value wasn't determined by their opinion. Silence is your best friend, Clara, she'd tell me. In a deposition, the person who speaks the most is the person who is losing. Let them fill the air with their noise. You just stay in the center of your truth. Thursday morning arrived with a sky the color of cold wood ash. The deposition was held in a high-rise office downtown, a place of white marble and glass that felt like a mausoleum for the living. Julian and Vanessa were already there when I walked in with Evelyn. They were sitting at a long mahogany table flanked by Marcus Thorne and a phalanx of junior lawyers in identical black suits. Julian looked smug, his arms crossed over his chest, his gold watch glinting under the fluorescent lights. Vanessa was tapping her manicured nails on the table, her eyes hidden behind those familiar oversized glasses. Marcus Thorne stood up, adjusting his tie. He was a man who smelled of expensive peppermint and ambition. Miss Sterling, thank you for joining us. I hope you've had time to consider our very generous offer. It would be a shame to drag your grandfather's name through the mud any further. My grandfather's name is already in the mud, Mr. Thorne, I said, sitting down. I'm just here to see who's holding the shovel. Julian let out a sharp, derisive snort. Still the dramatic artist, I see. Let's get this over with. Marcus, show her the reality of her situation. For the next 4 hours, Marcus Thorne lived up to his reputation. He was a predator. He asked me about the time I'd asked Grandpa for $500 to fix my car. He made it sound like I'd held him at gunpoint. He asked about a failed relationship I'd had in my 20s, suggesting I was prone to unstable attachments. He even brought up the fact that I'd been fired from the community center, the very firing Vanessa had orchestrated. "So, Miss Sterling," Thorne said, leaning in close, his voice dripping with feigned concern, "is it not true that you were facing eviction, that your career was non-existent, and that you saw Silas Sterling as your final desperate meal ticket? Is it not true that you manipulated a lonely 88-year-old man into signing away his life's work while his real heirs were busy actually running his company?" I felt the heat rising in my face. I felt the old Clara, the black sheep, wanting to scream, wanting to cry, wanting to tell them how I'd held Grandpa's hand while he coughed, how I'd read him poetry while they were at cocktail parties. But I felt Evelyn's hand graze my arm under the table, a gentle reminder. I took a deep breath. I let the silence stretch. I watched Marcus Thorne's confident smile to begin to waver just a fraction. "Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice calm and low, "but since you're so concerned with the real heirs and their real work, perhaps we should talk about the Starlight Initiative." The change in the room was instantaneous. It was as if someone had sucked all the oxygen out of the air. Julian's smug expression didn't just fade, it collapsed. He dropped his pen, the plastic clattering loudly on the marble table. Vanessa stopped tapping her nails. She went perfectly still, her mouth opening slightly. Marcus Thorne didn't miss a beat, but his eyes narrowed. "I don't see how that's relevant to the validity of the trust, Miss Sterling." "It's relevant to the character of the heirs you're defending," Evelyn Vance said, sliding a document across the table. "This is a record of a $40 million transfer from Sterling Holdings to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, signed by Julian Sterling 3 days before Silas passed away. It appears Julian was trying to protect the company's assets by hiding them from the very firm he was supposed to be leading." That's a lie," Julian stammered, his face turning a sickly mottled red. "That was a planned investment. It was authorized." "Authorized by whom, Julian?" I asked, looking him directly in the eye. "Not by Grandpa. He was senile, remember? And not by the board. They don't even know the Starlight Initiative exists. Yet." I leaned forward, the mahogany table cold against my palms. "You talk about me being desperate, Julian, but I wasn't the one stealing from our grandfather's legacy while he was still breathing. I wasn't the one so afraid of my own failures that I had to commit fraud to keep my house." Vanessa stood up, her chair screeching. "You think you're so much better than us, don't you? Sitting there with your justice and your morals. You're just as much a Sterling as we are, Clara. You're just as greedy. You just want the power to tell us what—" The first Monday of the new order didn't feel like a victory. It felt like walking into a house that had been on fire for an hour. The flames were out, but the smoke was thick enough to choke you, and the walls were still hot to the touch. I arrived at the Sterling Holdings headquarters at 8 a.m. For years I had avoided this building. It was a 50-story shard of glass and steel that seemed to pierce the very clouds, a monument to the idea that more is never enough. The lobby was a cathedral of white marble, and as I walked across it, my footsteps echoed with a sharp, lonely sound. The security guard, a man named Arthur who had worked there for 20 years, didn't ask for my ID. He stood up straight, his eyes wide and uncertain. "Good morning, Miss Sterling," he said, his voice hitching slightly. "Good morning, Arthur," I replied. I noticed the way his hands were clasped behind his back, trembling just a fraction. He was afraid. They were all afraid. To them, I wasn't the woman who taught art to children anymore. I was the storm that had unseated the king. I took the private elevator to the top floor. When the doors opened, the silence was absolute. The carpet was so thick it swallowed the sound of my boots. I walked past Julian's office. The door was open. I stopped and looked in. Julian was sitting at his desk, a massive slab of black obsidian. He wasn't looking at a computer screen. He was staring at a stack of yellowed, brittle newspapers, the scraps Grandpa had left him in the park. He looked up as I passed. His face was gaunt, the skin tight over his cheekbones. He hadn't shaved, and the shadow on his jaw made him look older, more like the father he had spent his life trying to please. "The 1954 edition," he said, his voice raspy. "There's an article here about a strike at the old textile mill. Did you know Grandpa started there? Not as an owner, as a floor sweeper." "I knew," I said softly, leaning against the doorframe. "I didn't," Julian whispered. "I thought we were always this. I thought the gold was in our blood. But in these papers, he's just a name on a list of workers asking for an extra 5 cents an hour." He looked at me, his eyes hollow. "He wanted me to read these so I'd see how far we've fallen, didn't he? Not how far we've come, how far we've fallen from the man he was. He wanted you to see the foundation, Julian. You can't build a skyscraper on a cloud." Julian let out a short, bitter laugh. "Well, the cloud just evaporated, Clara. I had to sell the Hamptons house this morning, and the boat. The teacher's salary doesn't cover the docking fees." I felt a surge of that old familiar guilt, but I pushed it down. "You still have a roof over your head, Julian, which is more than the people in the 4th Street development can say after you hike their rent." He flinched as if I'd slapped him. "I'm doing the work, Clara. I'm doing the damn pivot, but don't expect me to thank you for it." "I don't expect anything from you but honesty," I said, and I kept walking. My new office was Grandpa's old study at the end of the hall. It had been locked since he'd officially retired 5 years ago. I turned the key, the silver one, and stepped inside. The room was exactly as he'd left it. It smelled of old books, cedar, and the ghost of his pipe tobacco. It was the only room in the building that didn't feel like a cold calculation. I sat at his desk and looked at the mountain of folders waiting for me. This was the Sterling Heart Project, the massive redistribution of wealth he had envisioned. But as the day went on, I realized that the hardest part of having money isn't spending it, it's the way it changes the people around you. Around 2 p.m., my phone rang. It was David. David had been my mentor in art school, the man who had taught me that a brushstroke is a prayer. He was the one who had encouraged me to open the community classes. I hadn't spoken to him in months, and hearing his voice brought a lump to my throat. "Clara," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "I saw the news. My God, child, a Sterling trustee? I always knew you were destined for great things, but this is incredible." "It's a lot, David," I said, leaning back in the leather chair. "It's a lot of weight." "I'm sure it is. Listen, the reason I'm calling, the university is looking at a new wing for the fine arts department. We're short about $8 million. I was thinking, given your new position in our history, maybe we could sit down. It would be a wonderful way to cement your legacy in the art world." I felt a cold shiver go down my spine. It wasn't the request. It was the tone. He wasn't calling to see how I was. He was calling the legacy fund. "David, I have to follow the fund's guidelines. We're focusing on community-level impact right now, low-income access, not university wings." The silence on the other end was sharp. "Clara, surely you haven't forgotten who helped you when you couldn't afford a canvas. I took a chance on you. I think a little loyalty isn't too much to ask." "I haven't forgotten, David, but this money isn't mine to give as a thank you. It's a trust." "I see," he said, his voice suddenly cold, formal. "The black sheep finally finds a flock, and suddenly she's too important for the people who raised her. Typical Sterling. Enjoy the view from the top, Clara. I hope it's worth the price." He hung up. I stared at the phone, feeling a sting behind my eyes. It had begun, the slow erosion of my old life. To the wealthy, I was a threat. To the poor, I was a savior. And to the people in the middle,
I was a bank. I spent the rest of the afternoon in a haze of spreadsheets, trying to drown out the feeling of being hunted. By 6 p.m., the office was empty. I was packing my bag to leave when I heard a soft knock on the door. It was Vanessa. She wasn't wearing her designer glasses. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she looked smaller in her oversized trench coat. She was holding a small brown paper bag. "I brought dinner," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I figured you were still here. You were always a workhorse when you had a project." We sat on the velvet sofa in the corner of the office. She pulled out 2 containers of cheap Chinese takeout, the kind we used to eat in secret when we were kids because our father insisted on proper meals. "I went to the PR office today," Vanessa said, picking at her noodles. "I had to tell 3 clients I couldn't represent them anymore. One of them was Senator Higgins. He called me a disloyal bitch and threatened to ruin me." "I'm sorry, Vanessa." "Don't be," she said, looking up at me. "He is a crook. I knew it. I liked the power of being the one who kept him clean. It felt like I was winning a game. But today, looking at those pressed flowers Grandpa left me, I realized he was right. I was cultivating something that didn't have any roots. It was just pretty for a minute, and then it died." She reached into the bag and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. "I started a list today of all the people the Starlight Initiative hurt, the families who lost their deposits, the small contractors Julian never paid. There are over 200 of them, Clara. We'll make it right," I said. "The fund will pay them back, every cent plus interest." "I want to be the one to tell them," Vanessa said. "Not a lawyer, not a press release, me. I want to look them in the eye and apologize." I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I saw something that looked like peace. She wasn't fighting for her status anymore. She was fighting for her soul. "Grandpa would be proud of that, Vanessa. That's the most sterling thing you've ever said." We ate in silence for a while, the only sound the distant hum of the city outside the glass walls. For a moment, we weren't the trustee and the disgraced mogul. We were just 2 sisters in a room full of ghosts. But then the elevator chimed. Julian burst into the room. He wasn't calm anymore. He was vibrating with a manic, terrifying energy. He was holding his phone out like a weapon. "Did you do this?" he screamed, his voice cracking. "Did you authorize this?" "Julian, calm down," I said, standing up. "What are you talking about?" "The bank. They just called. My personal accounts, not the company ones, my personal ones have been flagged for an IRS audit. They're saying the Starlight money never was taxed. They're freezing everything, Clara. My house, my retirement, even the kids' college funds." "I didn't do that, Julian. I told you. The fund wouldn't report it as long as you cooperated." "Then who did?" he roared. "I did," a voice said from the doorway. We all turned. Standing there, silken and steady as always, was Marcus Thorne. But he wasn't standing there as Julian's lawyer. He was holding a briefcase, and he had a look of cold professional triumph on his face. "Marcus?" Julian whispered. "What are you doing here?" "I'm a man of business, Julian," Thorne said, stepping into the room, "and I realized very quickly that you were a sinking ship, but the Sterling Legacy Fund, that's a Leviathan. I decided to provide the IRS."
The air in the office after Marcus Thorne left felt thin, like the atmosphere on a high mountain peak where every breath has to be fought for. I stood by the window, my reflection ghost-like against the twinkling lights of the city below. Behind me, the silence was broken only by the ragged, uneven sound of Julian's breathing and the soft rustle of Vanessa's trench coat as she sat beside him. For the first time in our lives, the hierarchy of the Sterling family had been completely dismantled. It wasn't just that I had the money, it was that the myths they had built their lives upon, the myth of Julian's invincibility and Vanessa's social armor, had turned to dust. "He's going to take everything, isn't he?" Julian's voice was hollow, stripped of its resonance. He was looking at his hands, the hands that had signed away millions, now trembling in the light of the desk lamp. The house in Greenwich, the kids' trust funds. I'll be lucky if I'm not wearing a jumpsuit by Christmas. Julian, look at me, I said, turning away from the window. He didn't want to. He fought it, his shoulders hunched, his head bowed. But slowly, painfully, he lifted his gaze. I'm not going to let Thorn destroy you, and I'm not going to let the Sterling name become a synonym for a prison sentence. But I need you to listen, truly listen. The money in the Starlight accounts, the IRS wants their share, yes, but the rest of that money, it's going back to the contractors and the families you squeezed, every single one. If there's anything left, it goes into a legal defense fund that Evelyn Vance will manage, not Thorn, Evelyn. Why? Julian whispered. I spent 10 years making sure you felt like a failure, Clara. I mocked your clothes. I mocked your students. I told Grandpa you were a charity case every time he brought your name up. Why are you helping me? I walked over to him and placed my hand on the stack of old newspapers. Because Grandpa didn't leave me this key to punish you, Julian. He left it to me to save the family. And you are still my brother, even if you've forgotten how to be one. Vanessa reached out and took Julian's hand. The gesture was so simple, so human that it made my chest ache. For 20 years, their relationship had been a series of strategic alliances and shared secrets. Now it was just a sister holding on to her brother as the ship went down. Go home, both of you. Vanessa, take him to your place. Don't go back to the estate tonight. The press will be there by morning once Thorn starts leaking. I'll call Evelyn. We'll meet at the boathouse on Sunday, not as business partners, as family. They left together, their shadows stretching long across the marble floor. I stayed in the office for hours after that, the city outside turning from a frantic gold to a quiet midnight blue. I realized then that being the black sheep was a solitary path, but being the shepherd was even lonelier. The next few days were a masterclass in the legal war Evelyn Vance had promised. While Thorn was busy feeding scraps to the tabloids, Evelyn was in a windowless room at the IRS building laying out a trail of cooperation that turned Thorn's whistleblower status into accomplished status. He's a smart man, Marcus is, Evelyn told me over a late-night coffee in her kitchen. Her spectacles were perched on the end of her nose, and her table was buried under mountains of digital transcripts. He forgot one thing. Greed has a specific scent. He wasn't blowing the whistle out of a sense of duty. He was doing it to collect a finder's fee and secure a job. The government doesn't like being used as a personal headhunter. By Friday, the narrative had shifted. The headlines weren't about the manipulative black sheep anymore. They were about the sterling corruption and the brave new trustee who was voluntarily opening the books to make things right. It was a calculated risk. By exposing our own wounds, we robbed Thorn of the power to salt them. But the real work, the Sterling Heart Project, began in the mud. I decided that the first project wouldn't be a grand gala or a press conference. It would be the 4th Street development. Julian had planned to turn 3 blocks of historic brownstones into a glass-walled lifestyle center. He had already evicted half the tenants, leaving boarded-up windows and broken spirits in his wake. On Saturday morning, I didn't go to the office. I put on my old jeans, a pair of work boots, and a heavy flannel shirt. I drove to 4th Street. The neighborhood looked like a war zone. Trash skittered across the pavement, and the silence was eerie. I walked up to the first building, the one where a woman named Mrs. Gable had lived for 50 years before Julian's lawyers handed her a 30-day notice. I found the site foreman, a man named Ben, with hands like cracked leather and a face that looked like it had been carved from a mountain. He was sitting on a pile of lumber, looking at a set of blueprints with a disgusted expression. "You the new boss?" he asked, not bothering to stand up. "I'm Clara Sterling." He spit on the ground. "Another Sterling. Great. You're here to tell me we're tearing down the bakery today, or are we just going straight for the playground?" "Neither," I said, sitting on the lumber beside him. "We're tearing up these blueprints, Ben. We're going to restore the brownstones. We're going to put the bakery back, and we're going to turn the top floors into subsidized housing for the people who were forced out." That's a lot of money to set on fire, lady. The board won't like that. I am the board, I said, and I'd rather set the money on fire than use it to burn down a neighborhood. Can you do it? Can you build something that stays instead of something that just sells? A slow, crooked smile spread across Ben's face. I haven't done real restoration work in 20 years. They usually just want cheap and shiny. But yeah, I can do it if the check's clear. The checks will clear, I promised. I spent the rest of the day on that site. I didn't sit in a trailer. I helped the crew haul away the lifestyle center signage. I spoke to the neighbors who came out of their houses, suspicious and angry, and I told them the truth. I didn't promise them a miracle. I promised them their homes back. By the time I drove to the boathouse on Sunday, my hands were blistered and my back ached in a way that felt honest. The sun was setting over the lake, painting the water in strokes of copper and violet. Julian and Vanessa were already there. They weren't in their sports cars or SUVs. They had arrived in a single modest sedan. They were standing on the pier, looking out at the water. We didn't go inside the workshop. We sat on the edge of the pier just like we had when we were children, before the Sterling legacy had turned into a cage. I sold the watch today, Julian. His voice was quiet. He held up his bare wrist, the Patek Philippe. It paid for 3 months of Mrs. Gable's back rent and the legal retainer for the contractor's class action suit. How does it feel? I asked. He looked at his wrist, then at me. It feels light, Clara. For the first time in my life, I don't feel like I'm carrying the weight of a ghost. Vanessa leaned her head on Julian's shoulder. The gesture was so simple, so human that it made my chest ache. For 20 years, their relationship had been a series of strategic alliances and shared secrets. Now it was just a sister holding on to her brother as the ship went down. Go home, both of you. Vanessa, take him to your place. Don't go back to the estate tonight. The press will be there by morning once Thorne starts leaking. I'll call Evelyn. We'll meet at the boathouse on Sunday, not as business partners, as family. They left together, their shadows stretching long across the marble floor. I stayed in the office for hours after that, the city outside turning from a frantic gold to a quiet midnight blue. I realized then that being the black sheep was a solitary path, but being the shepherd was even lonelier. The greatest inheritance wasn't the trust or the buildings or the billions. It was the fact that for the first time in 40 years, we were just 3 people standing by a lake, waiting for the morning. I often think back to that day in the public park, the day my life was measured by an iron key and a handful of old newspapers. It's been 2 years now since the Sterling Heart Project broke ground. The brownstones on 4th Street are full of life again. The Silas Sterling Arts and Healing Center has expanded to 3 different cities, and the Black Sheep has become a name people use when they want to talk about a different kind of power. Julian works in the restoration office now. He doesn't have the obsidian desk anymore. He has a wooden one he built himself in the boathouse workshop. He's not the CEO of an empire. He's a man who makes sure the foundations of other people's homes are solid. He's thinner, he has more gray in his hair, but when he looks at his children, he doesn't see assets. He sees the future. Vanessa's library campaign was a success. She's become a voice for the voiceless, using her sharp mind and her silver tongue to protect the very things our father would have called insignificant. She still wears designer scarves, but she buys them from the local weavers she helps represent. As for me, I still live in my apartment above the bakery. I still teach my classes, but my studio is now the entire world. I've learned that a legacy isn't something you leave behind, it's something you leave within. It's the way you treat the person who has nothing to offer you. It's the way you handle the truth when a lie would be easier. It's the courage to be the black sheep when the rest of the flock is headed toward a cliff. Justice, I've found, is a slow-growing thing. It doesn't always come in a courtroom with a gavel. Sometimes, justice is just the quiet satisfaction of seeing a playground full of children where a luxury high-rise was supposed to be. Sometimes, justice is a brother and a sister finding their way back to each other through the ruins of their own greed.
I still have the iron key. I keep it on a chain around my neck. It's a reminder that the heaviest doors are often the ones we build around our own hearts, and the only way to open them isn't with force, but with the quiet, persistent key of truth. Grandpa Silas used to say that every person is a painting in progress. He'd say, "Clara, don't worry about the messy parts. Don't worry about the colors that don't seem to fit. Just keep painting until the shadows make sense." I think the shadows finally make sense now. So, as I leave you with this story, I want you to look at your own life. I want you to look at the worthless things you've been holding on to, the small dreams, the quiet truths, the relationships that everyone else told you were a waste of time. What if those are the keys? What if the thing that makes you the black sheep is the very thing that will save your family? Would you have the courage to open the box? Would you have the strength to let the old world burn so a new one could grow from the ashes? Tell me in the comments. Tell me about the times you were underestimated, the times you were cast aside, and the times you realized that your failure was actually your greatest victory. We are all part of this legacy, and your story is just as important as mine. Thank you for listening to my confession. Thank you for walking this long road with me. If you found a bit of light in these shadows, I hope you'll carry it with you. This has been Clara Sterling for Voices of Auntie May. Take care of your heart. It's the only inheritance that truly matters. Until we meet again, keep painting.